My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Season 3 of the How to Disaster podcast, where we help you recover, rebuild, and reimagine. During this season, we will be releasing Take Fives, shorter episodes that highlight some of our past guests speaking about similar issues, themes, topics. We wanted to do this so that perhaps it'd be easier if you only have a few minutes, but you wanted to connect with these focused episodes and guests, that you could condense all their messages into one smaller bite-sized piece. One of the things that we know about disaster is that we really have to meet people where they're at. And sometimes where you're at is you only have 5 minutes. We're very excited for the third season. We've got great guests and wonderful information and content about how to actually help get your community through to the other side. So thank you for joining us. And if you wish to find out more, please visit our homepage at afterthefireusa.org. Consider giving us a like or follow if you like this podcast. We really appreciate it, and thank you for your time.
Well, one missing part of that puzzle was Hurricane Irma hit before Maria. So the island was completely without power even before Maria. I left the island to work on the magazine. I needed power and internet, so I went to the States with a round trip ticket for 5 days, and then realized power was not to be returned for some time. So as I was watching it and figuring out when to come home, we see Maria forming off the coast of Africa. And that's when we began to get a little bit nervous about what was going to happen to the island. So that evening, actually, my partner was still here on the island. My daughter and I were in the States. That evening, I set up a GoFundMe, hoping to raise $1,000 to $10,000 to maybe send down a satellite phone or something. Because there were really not any other groups that were off the island and accessible with power to put the word out that they needed help. I think that's why the Viequeslove GoFundMe grew and grew, and through the magazine connections with every person who had ever visited Vieques, looking online to see how they could help. We had people from 1974 who came on their honeymoon here and have never returned, but felt such a connection to the island that they gave $500. And the GoFundMe just grew exponentially. In 5 days, we had over $500,000, and it was just an incredible show of love for Vieques.
I interviewed disaster survivors in Rockport, Texas. That was the area that first experienced the landfall of Hurricane Harvey. And I wanted to understand what their experiences were with volunteers, and then dive deeper into, did the volunteers respect the culture of the community? Did the community even identify what their culture was before or after the disaster? And then if they had that magic ball to train and advise future disaster volunteers, what would those considerations be? So it's interesting, and I'll go to the culture of the community first. I heard very clearly in that community, there's a case of have and have nots. So it's a coastal community, it's a small coastal town. And along the coastline, like many coastlines, there's some very expensive homes and some pretty wealthy individuals. And as you move away from the coastline, you have the working class of the community. You have individuals who have lived in that community for years. You have folks that have worked on shrimping boats for generations, fishing boats for generations. And so they tended to be the have-nots. They had their own sense of community. They had their own sense of purpose, but it was almost as if there were different pockets within just a very small town of different cultures based on class, some based on race, but mostly I saw a very large class division. I had one couple I interviewed who recounted a story that they were in line to register with FEMA and to talk to SBA about assistance. And they talked about how they were a working class family. And in line was a gentleman who was from a very wealthy portion of town. And they said, I know had it not been for Harvey, this gentleman would have never talked to us. But we bridged a friendship with him because we had a common shared experience. And we still have that same shared experience, right? And so they still have a relationship with him now. And had it not been for that disaster, they may have never had that opportunity to meet.
So for some things we're domestic, for some things we are international, like federal tax law, right? But then what ends up happening is that it leads to a systemic underinvestment in key both hard infrastructure, like, electric grids, roads, bridges, telecommunications, et cetera. And then it also leads to a huge underinvestment in, soft infrastructure, which is, education system, healthcare, et cetera. And as a result, when the hurricanes Irma and Maria hit, we had a total power outage across the entirety of the island. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, basically had 100% failure rate across the island. And it was devastating. That ended up being the number one factor that led to, over 2,800, close to 3,000 excess deaths as a result of the hurricane. So while some people died from, injuries sustained during the hurricane or collapses of, infrastructure, those tended to be like relatively small, but a huge number of the people who died, which, probably wouldn't have died if we hadn't had the hurricane, they died because, their electricity was out and they didn't have, the access to transportation to get them to the healthcare that they needed, or they were elderly people, their ventilators or other, medical equipment wasn't functioning, their refrigerators for their medicines weren't operating. So it was pretty devastating. So that inequality that happens under colonialism creates a structural vulnerability that becomes exacerbated and highlighted, and basically the mask was taken off of the situation in Puerto Rico when the hurricane happened.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.
And this is something that for me, who were being very mission-oriented, trying to help, that slipped me. And I learned a lot when they told me, we have Robert Becker, an expert and a political advisor, who said, let's set them up in the plaza and let people talk to their families. This will make for a communal calmness. And they did. And people got 1 or 2 minutes to talk, and they would reach, and we would help them because it's a satellite phone. And they would call, and it would be a progression. You would see the people first like anxious, worried, then the phone would pick up and they would break down. We even had to prep them, like, don't cry, you use your time well, ask them for what you need, let them know you're alive. After that, we took the phone, and when that happened, there was a relaxation. And so they were able to function better in the town. And it's the little things like that that you learn to adjust from. We had a hero here, a guy on a Pathfinder with a ham radio, amateur radio. And when nobody could talk to anybody, that one guy would go to the hospital, would go to the police, and he would talk to anything. So we learned from that. And Kelly started a program with Fe que Transforma, a local group here. Now there's 42 radio operators with radios in an emergency net, including boats for fishers, people on cars, resiliency hubs. Vieques did not have a resiliency hub. Now it has 3 to build 1 building. So part of the real lessons is take the time when there is not a disaster to adjust from the lessons learned, like what we're talking about here now, and to use these resources that are being put out there to be resiliency. And it was certainly a learning experience for us.
Tornadoes are the same thing. Your house is gone when a tornado hits, right? And so I met with a couple who their house was completely gone. And their insurance company was like, well, how do we know this is what you had in your house? And I met with them and I said, after the event, somebody in the family was standing around the grandkids and they were like, and we were just here last week and we were just having a big old family celebration, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wait, did anybody post pictures on Facebook? And they were like, yes. And I was like, pull those pictures up. You have photos of the house. You have photos of the contents. So it's not always lost. Think about what you did leading up to that. Social media can be really powerful in that sense, because how many of us take selfies or, you know, do videos or whatever have you, and you might have that video. But you're absolutely right, Jennifer. Every time I go on vacation, I use that as my mark, or even if I travel for work, I use that my reminder before I leave the house. I take a videotape of my house. If my house is robbed while I'm gone, I have proof, but then I'm always updating what's in my house and what my house looks like for insurance purposes. Most people have a smartphone, so you can do it.
You know, 2017 was possibly one of the hardest years of my life. And I sit here today in 2021, but if I think back to that moment, the hairs in my arm get raised because there's just a lot of emotion associated with it. I was serving at the time as the deputy director of the Washington, D.C. office of the governor of Puerto Rico. So I wasn't physically located in Puerto Rico. And we had two back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes, Hurricane Irma, which came first and grazed Puerto Rico's northwest portion. There was an island municipality, Vieques, that was heavily impacted. There was power outages throughout the island, but within a few days, most of the power had been restored. And then less than 2 weeks later, we got hit by Hurricane Maria. And Hurricane Maria had been a Category 5. It just downgraded before hitting Puerto Rico, but it was a very powerful Category 4, which is incredibly devastating in terms of the speed of the wind, the amount of water that came, and it crossed through the center of the island from one end to the other diagonally. And that meant that there wasn't a single inch of Puerto Rico that was not heavily impacted by the hurricane. In Washington, D.C., our office essentially went, you know, from one day being a operation that mostly focused on public policy issues and supporting the governor's agenda and lobbying Congress and interacting with the federal executive, to all of a sudden becoming a disaster, you know, response center. The government of Puerto Rico as a whole was essentially shut down. Electricity was shut down across the island. Our entire telecommunications infrastructure was shut down. For several days, it was just anyone who wanted to communicate had to have a satellite telephone to be able to do that. So, you know, from one moment to the other, our office became the only entity in the entire government of Puerto Rico that was fully operational. So we were in direct communication with the White House, with FEMA, with, you know, the governor, which thankfully we were able to communicate with him, but we were channeling all of his communications through our office. And we were also the recipients of an overwhelming amount of attention and requests for assistance from those 5 million Puerto Ricans that live stateside that were, you know, worried sick about their, you know, 3 million family members on the island. They were calling, no one was answering, text messages were left, you know, unanswered. And people had this huge sense of fear and desperation of not knowing what was going on. To give you an idea of the scale of what we confronted, I think in a 48-hour period, our phone system handled about 30,000 calls.
Wow.
It's insane. It's insane. So it was very overwhelming. It was disorienting. There was so much to do that it was very hard to kind of wrap your head around. And my job was basically to continue facilitating the governor's communication with, all of the pertinent federal authorities, the, FEMA, White House, Department of Defense, every other federal entity that could be brought to bear in that situation. And then also to begin outreach to Congress to let them know, hey, this just happened. The scale of devastation is unknown as of yet, but it looks like it is a total catastrophe. So that basically went on for, a few months before things started to settle down even a little bit.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.